was taken from Vietnam to be put in America during the Vietnam War, at the end of the Vietnam War, for her protection. And in doing so, she basically was stripped of her life in Vietnam and put into Los Angeles and later Portland, Oregon, where she grew up in a very white Catholic family. And so she lost all contact with her real family, her biological family, and has no really continuation of her culture. She barely remembers any of the language. She only knows really her name and her own in Vietnamese. And being born out of that, I know that I'm half Vietnamese, but I struggled with identifying as Asian American for a very long time, especially when I started applying to colleges and, you know, would put my race down as Asian American, but I felt guilty doing so because I felt like culturally I wasn't Asian American. I grew up in a very privileged white family and had never been exposed to my Asian culture or Asian heritage in a way that I felt authentically, quote unquote, Asian. And so for a long time, I carried a guilt around with me of not being truly Asian in a way that I felt I put shame on myself for being white when I was Asian, I guess. And I've learned to understand, because of my, you know, socialization and because of how I grew up. It doesn't mean I'm not Asian. It just means I'm not connected to that culture in a way that a lot of, you know, Asian Americans are. But that doesn't mean I'm any less Asian. It's just I'm Asian from a different perspective. Mm-hmm. But I've been privileged as I've been given white privilege as an Asian American at the same time, or as a white Asian American.
Appreciate that very much. Thank you, Eli.
Thank you.
Very nice. Anyone else? How has race impacted you?
I have a question for him. I'm wondering if people react differently to an Asian American than they do to a Black American or an African American. Do they get stopped when they're driving down the street? Do they get followed when they're in a store? Do they have the same experience? My guess is they don't, at least not as much. So that colors things a bit.
Yes, absolutely. I'm not saying that I have the same experience of African Americans because I'm not white. Right. Asian Americans, especially depending on what area of Asia you come from, or you know, if you're explicitly Japanese or Chinese or however you identify, you get different, you know, generalizations, stereotypes, different cultural, I guess, dividends and other things. Being like not so obviously Asian, especially, didn't affect me to the point where I was, you know, picked on or bullied or had any run-ins unfairly with the law. Especially in the area that I grew up, nobody really sought that out. It was a pretty sheltered, small community, and my race didn't affect me in a way that like nationally most people of color can be. And so that's a unique experience, and I can't speak for all Vietnamese Americans, but we are treated, I would say, overall differently from pure white Americans, but it's not the same by any means as African Americans or other Blacks.
Thanks.
So perhaps, oh, go ahead. Were you just saying thanks? Which you might have been. So there are perhaps stereotypes, prejudice against certain different groups of color, right? It's different. It's different. People have stereotypes and prejudices against different groups of people. They prejudge them. We all do, actually. Who else would like to comment about the general question? How has race impacted your life?
Hi, this is Kevin. Um, First thing I thought of is actually probably pretty obvious because of the fact that I'm white and because of where I live geographically. I grew up in a bubble of whiteness, of stereotypes, of protection from diversity, of never being challenged by, never having my race challenged or having to really deal very much with people of other races until I reached college. And so I've only had like a couple of people of color as close friends over my entire lifetime. Um, and I was just thinking about the fact if I had married a person of color, how different my life would have probably turned out in terms of my understanding of what it's like to live in America as a person of color. If I had married a white one, or I married a white woman instead of an Asian or a black woman, or etc. And that would have made a huge difference. That would have made a huge difference in my life, becoming part of the extended family of people of another race. I think it would have been an extremely enriching opportunity, actually, when I think about it, in terms of culture, food, stories, global experiences. It would have been, I think it would actually be an advantage in some ways. So that's pretty much my reflection.
Appreciate that, Kevin.
Sure.
I think I was so protected, really. I think back to the late 50s and early 60s, and I was not aware that other people in other parts of the country had to deal with racism so much, because I think I just didn't even see it. I wasn't aware that it was there. My family didn't have racist attitudes. They didn't make jokes about people of other cultures. I remember the era when Polish jokes were such a thing, and the Polish jokes always just made me uncomfortable. But a friend went into the Army in the late 50s and was stationed in Fort Knox, Kentucky. And he was stunned when he got there and saw the white-only drinking fountains, theaters, signs, all of this. We were kind of oblivious to the fact that those kinds of things happened. And here we were in nice white Portland, Oregon. Now we find out that it's not so nice. So that was a real eye-opener and a real shock to me to find out that what things were like in the South. And even years later, a school that I was working at, one of the staff there went to New Orleans for a conference, and she said it was just pretty shocking. She says it's like they're still fighting the Civil War there. So that was pretty shocking also. And this was in the 80s.
Thanks, Gail. That's very appreciated. And just to comment on Portland, you know, it hasn't been that long in Oregon and in Portland where racist policies and laws were on the books. I mean, it really has not been that long. Racism, slavery may not have been in Portland or Oregon, but the racist policies post-slavery are pretty abhorrent. It was a very racist city.
Yeah.
Very city until not that long ago. I think Ethar has a question.
Oh no, I just wanted to add, not like for personally as a mother, race has impacted my life in that I have a 20-month-old baby girl. And so when I was initially looking for daycare for her, it was really important for me to get to see what staff look like, what the curriculum teaches, what kind of songs they teach, if they promote language learning, even at that early age, what the dolls look like was really important to me. So whenever I'm touring, when I was touring at that time, I would look at all the dolls, and, you know, most of the time there wasn't a doll her color. And so these are things that I never thought I'd be thinking about, but because, you know, being a mother, you just think of all these different things, but you don't necessarily think of those little things that matter, because if there's a doll that's her color, she's going to feel like she belongs. So I just kind of wanted to share that.
Thank you, Ethar.
Could I
Yes.
say something? I came from that Pacific Northwest bubble where there weren't many blacks or any for most of the time. But later in my life, as I got into social services, Governor Dan Evans of Washington appointed me to a task force to go throughout the state and find people who needed help, medically, educational. And I developed a heart for the American Indian. I visited longhouses, I sat in smoky tents, and I heard stories that today horrify me about how we treated the American Indians. And also along the way, we came across a lot of people from Mexico. In those days, we called them wetbacks because they swam across the river to get here to work in our fields. We also had to deal with those. So my whole perspective isn't necessarily black. It's other people who were shoved aside and put on reservations of the poorest possible land we could find to put them on. Statement ends.
Thank you. Anyone else before we move on to the next round?
Oh. I wanted to, excuse me, were we moving on?
Not if you have a comment, if you would contribute.
Yes, I do. And I think this is one of the reasons why I was drawn to participate, is because I think there are two different things that are at play as I'm working through what I can do in my place. As I think of my own experiences with how I was raised, my encounters with different people, my language, how I speak about things, that I felt pretty good about. I'm still learning things, but the part that I'm kind of surprised that I'm missing is, and I've only in the last, I guess, 4 or 5 years, understand more of the structural racism in the country and trying to fit in how I was raised and how I interact with people in my daily. And then what can I do as an advocate for the structural racism that is an illness in the I see it as an illness in the country.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Bobby. And as I said last week, the CDC and local health departments and Ethar can even acknowledge this, that racism is considered an illness. It's a disease in society. So thank you. I think we're going to move on to the next round, but before I do that, I need to back up, take a step back to the group, because with Galen, she asked about what does racial humility, not empathy, look like. My brain completely disconnected and obviously is excited about racial humility, but that wasn't her question. Her question was about racial humility, not empathy. So let me just tell you what it looks like is what exactly we're doing right now. Look at go into gallery mode on your Zoom. This is a great example of what racial humility looks like, especially with white people. It is being humble. It is being brave and having the courage to say, you know, I don't know everything, but I'm willing to stop and I'm willing to listen. I'm willing to talk about something that's not comfortable to talk about. I'm going to be humble. I'm going to practice racial humility. Does that make sense? Humility. Okay.
Greg,
Yes.
I have been trying to talk earlier, and I was just talking, and I didn't realize my mic was muted.
Oh, no.
The moment may have passed, but I was going to say that in our breakout session, someone used a term, a phrase, and then when we came back to the whole group, the young man, I forgot his name. He's the young man who's Vietnamese and white. Okay, he said made the same comment. He said the same phrase, and I hear that and around from time to time. And I'm going to say what it is in a second. But first, I'd like to say that, you know, words, the connotations, you know, of words. There are hidden impacts of racism, where we believe we don't think that there's an impact, but there is. And I'm going to tell you what that phrase is. I've heard it twice so far. Pure white was said when they mentioned being white. The word, the adjective pure was placed in front of it. And I just found that very, very interesting. You know, to say such a thing, because that's not something I hear Native Americans say. I've never heard Black person say that. Pure Black. You know, meaning that they're not mixed with that both parents are, and then their parents and so forth are of the same ethnicity, which is probably difficult to really document. I mean, for sure, many people are mixed, as you know, then don't realize it. But I just thought that was interesting that I hear, you know, mostly white people, when they refer to not being mixed, they say pure white.
Right.
So,
And I thank you, Erica, for pointing that out. To respond to that, I think that comes from my privilege of growing up as, you know, there's the connotation with that adjective, as you said, with pure, and I think that comes from the inherent privilege that may not even be seen on the faces like racist, but like you said, it's a matter of perspective of putting whites above other people, and that is something that I think is a very good point that you made for pointing that out, because I don't want to come off as saying, you know, I'd rather be white, because I'd rather be me, and I'm very proud of you know, my Vietnamese heritage. I'm very proud of my mother for being who she is, and so, you know, in saying that I wasn't pure white, I mainly meant to say that I wasn't, you know, I wasn't not Asian. I was also.
I know that, and there's no harm in I don't believe when people say it that you know, the times that I've heard it, that there's any malintent. It's just it's just interesting to me.
Of course.
And that you know, that I hear you know, certain people say it.
And I think it's like you said, there's not necessarily malintent, but there's still impact, and I think you kind of pointed that out, how it's interesting how the words we use to describe ourselves race wise, I think tells a lot about, you know, the structure that we're built in.
That's right.
And children, when they hear those types of things, you know, we have a lot of brilliant, bright, precocious, curious children in the world, and they're thinking, you know, as I'm not a child anymore, but as a little girl, I heard a lot, and I thought very deeply about what the adults around me were saying, black and white, native too, you know, all of the adults. And I really would ponder such things, and how, you know, how race impacted me in so many ways. But one way I can mention is the sense of not really, I mean, I feel like I belong as myself, like I belong wherever I go, that's where I belong. I've always felt that as a child, but also I felt as though I didn't quite belong because other people wouldn't just let me belong. You know, I would hear a lot of, what are you mixed with? You know, from other children, or, you know, and then adults, you know, they ask you questions like, well, who do you identify with? Well, to me, your race, your ethnicity, or, you know, your genotype is fixed. It is what it is. So there's no choice, but the socialization part of it, or the, you know, there's a lot of pressure to pick, you know, if you ask me what do I identify with most? Human beings.
Mhm.
But other people want you have to check this box, and you have to do that. So it's interesting, as a person of mixed ethnicity, and I don't know if I have an unusual phenotype, but people do often, as I've, you know, been growing up over the years. I've had very long hair all the way down my back, and very short hair, so as well. But I usually get people trying to figure it out, you know. So, you know, what I look like what is this person? And so that's another thing too. But I've always listened and learned. I've had to know how to act around whoever I'm around.
Right.
So anyway, I'll stop talking now.
Thanks, Erica, for sharing. That's well said. Where are you calling in from tonight?
Baton Rouge. I'm in the South.
Oh.
Yeah.
Say it again.
Well, you know, Greg, I grew up in California, but I've been living in Louisiana, in Baton Rouge, for about 9 years now.
Oh, good for you. That's wonderful. Thank you. All right. In the chat box, we had pure white ? And somebody said, genetically, there is no such thing. And someone else said, it needs to be recognized, no such thing. Let's see, there's another one coming up. Okay. And yes, I agree. Thank you for sharing, Erica, Eli. We're going to go to the next round. And I'll let Father Fred take that one. What can be done to change the impact of socialization on our understanding of racism? And we're going to have about a longer time, 8 to 10 minutes on this one in breakouts again. And the question will be in the chat box, so you can refer back to it, okay? Lori,
I'd like to
go ahead, Fred.
I'd like to say at the beginning of this that 2 or 3 things in terms of history. There was some discussion about Asians, and it wasn't until the 1930s that Chinese Oregonians could buy land in Oregon. And I think there are a lot of people that don't realize that. Also, I remember when I was a boy and I was in taverns sometimes with my parents, and I remember seeing a sign there that said, we do not serve Indians. They didn't say Native Americans, Indians, alcohol. And I remember as a little boy asking, why is that? And he said, well, those people just don't know how to handle their alcohol. And so that was the explanation for that. And then the other thing I wanted to mention in terms of Oregon is that in the southern part of the state, in Jackson and County and Douglas County and Josephine, there were what they called special laws where they were sundowners, where African Americans had to be out of town by sundown. And that was so strictly enforced that you couldn't get utilities if you were able to buy like a house there and that sort of thing. And even like the Globetrotters, when they came there, they had to stay out of town. They could play there, but they had to stay out of town. And I remember Angus Bulmer, who founded the Shakespearean Festival, was my Shakespeare prof in college. I remember him saying when they first started the Shakespeare plays, they had to have native Africans play the black roles in Shakespeare because African Americans could not go to school there. And one of the first, Don Pedro Colley, who some of you may remember, he's still alive. He was an actor, and he was the African American who was on Daniel Boone on TV. And I was in the 8th grade with him in Klamath Falls, and we did have African Americans there because it was a railroad town. And he and I played two of the kings in the Christmas play. But he was one of the early African Americans that was admitted to Southern Oregon University college at that point. And so it was a very mixed bag down there. The other thing I wanted to mention as we talk about socialization, as I went through the list earlier, sometimes socialization is taught and sometimes it isn't taught. But I remember as a boy, when I was 16 years old, going through the South on the train with some fellow high school students, and we were on our way to Washington, D.C. for President Eisenhower's second inauguration. And we went down through California and then straight across the South to Washington. And as we got into New Orleans, that was really interesting. This is 1957, and seeing restrooms that had been whitewashed where it said colored only. Well, that had been whitewashed, and I remember in the train station there was this very large African American, and I had some bags, and we were staying all night there. And this baggage guy saying, "Hey, boy, get this gentleman's bag," and just ordering him to. Well, I was the boy actually, if you wanted to look at it that way, and this guy was probably in his 20s, and so that was kind of our first impression of all of that. And then we rode trains or buses in New Orleans. And we got on the bus the first time and somebody kind of mumbled, move the sign. And so we said, what do you know, and they pointed and there was this sign and it said colored only. And as the whites filled up the bus, well, then you move the sign back and then it got less and less space. And so I stood up, being a northern kid, I stood up and gave an old lady my seat and was quickly told that I needed to sit back down because you know, the buses were really, this was Jim Crow. And so we were able to experience that. And then on the train, I wanted a magazine one night, and they told me it was in the back car on the train, and I went back, and the conductor said, "What are you doing in here?" And I was in the colored car where the conductor sat, and he told me he would bring me a magazine and to get out of there. So here's some kids who are 16, 17 years old experiencing what was left of Jim Crow and some of the other things that were going on down there. A lot of socialization is taught. And that's what I'm saying here. So you might want to think about that as you go into your next session in small rooms as you read, as you, let's see. So the next one then is what can be done to change the impact of socialization on our understanding of racism. So you might think about that, think about where you've experienced socialization and where racism has impacted you.